we're going to look into lighting and rendering. So rendering is essentially adding light to a scene and calculating how that light is going to affect your scene. If you go to this shortcut up here, or if you select your rendering menu under your drop down, and you go to render settings, you should get this window. So again, you can either access it going to render settings, or by clicking on this shortcut, or by going to Windows, rendering editors, and render settings. This is where you can change all the different settings for your render. And we'll look into different tabs. So first of all, you can see here that we are using Arnold Renderer. If you drop down, you'll see that Maya has different rendering engines. And Arnold Renderer is the professional quality renderer that is included with Maya. So we'll mostly be working with this one for this class. Depending on the one that you choose, your tabs might change. So if you for some reason don't see a tab, you might be in the wrong renderer. So go ahead and select Arnold Renderer, and let's look at these different tabs. So the common tab is where you're gonna see all your settings for your image file. Here you can change your image format, you can assign a file name, and it'll by default save it to your images folder if you've set your project correctly. Remember, you need to set your project so that all of the directories within Maya are aligned to that file and that scene. So besides your image format, you can also have other settings such as, the color space you want to work with, or the camera that you want to render. We haven't really added cameras to our scene, so right now we are working with the default perspective view. If you ever change this view, this is basically the view that you'll get rendered out. We can change image size settings, so there's several presets here, or you can input your own image size by adding the pixel size here. This is the resolution we'll be mostly working, since we're not working with print, we'll be staying at the default 72 pixels per inch resolution for any images that live in the screen. So these are some basic settings for your image. If we move to the next tab, this is the Arnold Settings tab. So your Arnold Renderer tab is having different drop downs. The first one has to do with the sampling, and this means how many samples per pixel it's gonna get. The higher the number, the higher the quality of your image, but at the same time this means that it's gonna take longer to render. So you always want to have the settings be at the minimum number, but at the same time having them so that the quality of your image is good. We'll look into all of these specific settings in the future, and for now you can just leave them at this default. We can also look into the filter. So this is basically your sample, the type of filter your sample will use. We can also leave this at default for Gaussian. And we also have ray depth. So ray depth means how much light bounces in your scene. And we also have the diffuse bounces. So these are like the secondary in lighting. And if you do more than 2, you'll start to get indirect lighting. So indirect lighting means, for example, the light of my candle, the way that it hits other materials and then bounces from one material to the next, and all the indirect illumination that my objects will receive from one light source. The depth of specularity has to do with reflection and transmission. And transmission is how light passes through transparent surfaces. We can also add in environments here, and we can also control motion blur. We'll look into this in the future when working with moving image or animation. And we also have this lights drop down, which has to do with how we can control each light in our scene. Right now we don't have any lights, so you won't see any of these light links. But this just has to do how lights are linked together. If we go to this third tab, all we need to see here is this device selection drop down, and you should have it by default at CPU. You'll only use GPU if you have a really fast graphics card in your computer, but by default we'll be rendering with the CPU and not with our graphics card. So these are the three main tabs you need to remember, and basically the first one has to do with your image settings, the file type, the size of your image, and then the second tab has to do more with the quality settings of your rendering, which will definitely dictate how much time it takes to render an image as well.